Okay, now that you have Unity Hub installed, when you open up Unity Hub, you will come to this page. So you have your projects, which I have a couple on the go. This is where you will manage and create your projects. Learn has some interactive tutorials you could work on. Community has where you can go on to and ask questions as well as find some answers to some common questions. And then installs, if you haven't installed Unity yet, this is where you will be installing it. So just from Unity Hub, you will need to go to installs and then you're going to add. So currently I have the 2020 version there. If we install the newest version, for example, you would say Unity 2021, next. And then in the next, you need to make sure you have Visual Studio installed. So this will be where you do your scripting in C# to allow your characters to interact and move in your world. There are other platform supports. I currently am using just Universal Windows Platform Build support. You could look at adding other ones if you want to kind of expand on that. So then you would just say next, and then you would go about installing it. But I have it installed, so I'm just going to go back to the 2020 version that I have. So in the projects, I have a couple on the go, as I said. So you are going to create new, and then in your new, you are going to give your project a name. So I'm going to create a 2D project, and then whatever you want the name of your game to be. So I'm just going to call it, let's just call it Froggy. So Froggy is the name of the game, and then the location. So this will be set as an automatic to wherever you installed Unity. You could create another folder to store your projects in if you want. So then we're going to create 2D, and it does take a while for the project to build. So I'm going to pause out here while it creates it. So again, just make sure 2D is selected and then create. Okay, so now that the project has been created, when your project opens, you're going to have this should show up. It might look slightly different depending on the version and the setup. So a few things on the right-hand side is the inspector. You can obviously drag these in, so you can make your screen size bigger. We can make the inspector smaller and so on. So you could move those around as you wish. Similarly, you could drag the different, so I can take this animation tab and drag it out. If I wanted to add it to a different spot, you can add it to a different spot. So I'm just going to leave it down here. In the inspector, you will be able to see the characteristics of the assets that you have installed into the game, and you'll see that in a second. So in the center screen is where your scene is, and then you also have a game view and the animator, which we'll be working with a little bit later. And then on the bottom, currently I have the console, which is where you will see if you have errors in your code or errors in your graphics or things like that, this is where you will see that. So right now I'm just going to clear it. The tile palette we'll be working with in a second, but it is where you are going to have your background scene objects and things like that. You can just paint your scene in. And then the animation, again, we'll see later where you can create your animations for your characters to give them life. On the left-hand side, so we have the assets themselves is where all of your objects and things will be stored. So the music, the art for your characters, for the background, and so on. So for the assets, we're going to be using a pixel adventure set that's already created. So first you need to go into, so go onto Google, and you're going to go to itch.io. And in itch.io, there is a specific one that I am going to use. You could search for 2D platformer, you could search for RPG, you can search for music, and then similarly, you could find free ones. However, since I know specifically which ones we're using, type in Pixel Adventure. And then we're going to be using this set here. So the Pixel Adventure from Pixel Frog. So it is public domain, which means that licensing wise, you can use it, rebuild it, change the animations and so on. So we're going to download it. And then for the download, it does say that, it's a $2. The asset pack is free, but the developer does accept your support. So you could choose to pay if you want. We're going to say no thanks, just take us to the download. And then you click download. And in the download, it will download it into your downloads folder. And then from there, you will need to unzip it. Okay, so with it downloaded, so I have it downloaded and I have the second version as well, which has other enemy animations. So I've unzipped it into this folder here. And then what we want to do, because you want to try to keep your assets organized, we're going to, in the assets, I'm going to create, so right click and then create a folder, and we're going to call it art. And then in the art folder, so if you open it, we are just going to drag, so take the unzip file and drag it into the folder. And it's going to move to copy them all over. Okay, so now that they're copied over, we have the Pixel Adventure characters and animations. So in here we have a variety of different objects and tiles. So we have the background, main characters, so on. So for the main character, you can choose one that you want to use. I'm going to use the Ninja Frog. And to create your character, we are going to create the object itself. So you can always take these and drag any of these into the, so for example, I'm going to use the idle one and take it and drag it up into here. So this creates a game object. However, what you will notice is that this game object has all of the idle animation. So the idle animation is just, it as the character is standing still, it will give it some life. So it's going to be just moving slightly to give it some life. So what we need to do though is to take these and cut them so that we don't have all of these as one game object. So we're going to delete it rather. So right click, delete that from the game itself, and we're going to go back to idle. And what we want to do, so as I said, so in the inspector you have the characteristics of this specific graphic. So a few things, so for all of these, we want to make sure that these are Sprite 2D. So if yours is set to default, make sure it's Sprite 2D. There are multiple images in that. As we saw, there are multiple images for it. I'm going to set these to 16 pixels per unit. And then we're going to apply these, and then we're going to go to the Sprite Editor. So in the Sprite Editor, we know that these are, so based on down here, sometimes you can identify, so these are 32 by 32. So we want to slice these so that they are grid by cell size and 32 by 32 pixels, and then slice them. So what that has done is taken all of those in that one specific graphic and sliced it into each of the individual characters, and then apply that. So we can close that out. Now if we go back to the idle image, you can see that under there now it has created all of these different images for it. So I'm going to take the first one, or 0, and drag it in. So here's another thing that you will need to do. So because these are pixel images, so this looks blurry. So in some ways it might look better because their edges are rounded. However, it does look blurry for the most part. So what you want to do typically with these types of tiles and graphics is you want to, so if we go back to idle, again, you need to change this filter mode so that it's not bilinear. So bilinear will take an average and kind of round out the pixels beside each other. So we want to set it as point no filter, and it makes a much clearer pixel image of your character. And then apply that. And again, I did that with the full where you had all that set, right? So it'll do the same thing for all of these. So whatever you change on this specific graphic will change all of your individual sprites that you had spliced out. So now that we have a character in the game, we want to now add a background to it. So for the background, what you're going to do is, so if we go up to backgrounds, we have these backgrounds. You could do the same thing. You could drag these in, create game objects. So we can move that game object by clicking up here, and then we can move that blue square over here. You could stretch it, you do whatever. However, if you are pasting these on and creating multiple game objects, it does get very hard in terms of the number of game objects you would have in your actual scenes. So that's not what we're going to do for this. So we're going to, again, right click that, delete it. What we want to do is create a tile map. So a tile map will allow you to paint the scene in behind your character and the objects that you're going to be interacting with. So if you right click in the scene, go down to 2D object and go to tile map. So now it has created a tile map. In order to paint on a tile map, we need to have a tile palette. So again, for the tile palette, if it's not showing up, i.e. if it's not installed into the version that you have, or it's not already open as a window, to get it, you just go to Window, and then go down to 2D, and then you're going to go to Tile Palette. And then the Tile Palette will open up, and then you can drag it down into wherever you want it to anchor it to, whichever side, so you can anchor it over here and so on. So for the Tile Palette, we want to create a new Tile Palette. So we're going to call it Pixel Add, create the Tile Palette. And again, in terms of organizing assets, we're going to put this in the art folder. So in the art folder, we are going to, let's call it Pixel Add Tile Palette. Oh, that's not going to work. I have to create the folder. So new folder, and we want to call it Pixel Add Tile Palette. And then, no. And then we're going to select that tile palette as our folder. So that's the folder we're using. And now for the object, so to create the tile palette, it's quite simple once you have that done. You are simply just dragging in. So if we use the, let's use the green background. No, actually green will go with, let's use the brown background. So for the brown background, you're going to drag it down into the tile palette. However, similar to what we did with the pixel frog, you need to, because these are all set as 100, we want, again, these to be 16 pixels. We want it as a multiple, so we're going to splice it, same as we did for before. And same thing, you want to make sure this is point and no point, or no filter. And then apply that. And then we're going to go Sprite Editor, and we're going to slice that so that it is, so we're going to set this actually to 16 by 16. And then we're going to paint the background in. Now, again, you could choose to do other things here. You could, so we could take this and make it 32 by 32, 64 by 64, which you wouldn't want, so essentially you would want to have these where that it's splicing it into different things. So we're going to slice that, apply it, and now if we drag it down into, so essentially you're just taking it, dragging it into the tile palette. And again, we want to make sure that we're saving these all into the art. So into the art and into the palette, and then select that folder. And the reason that is so when you're creating these, for this one specifically, it's creating 16 individual objects. And as you get more, as you'll see when we do the terrain in a minute, there's going to be hundreds of different objects created. So you want to make sure that they're somewhat organized and all not all scattered through here. So now that we have that, to create the tile map, essentially you just click on Tilemap, and then we have a paintbrush tool, so you can select the whole thing, which is what I'm going to do, and then you can begin painting the scene. And I'm going to pause out and finish on doing that. Okay, once you have your scene painted, so if you go off and you make a little error, that's fine. It's easy to correct. You can click the eraser. This, because currently I have the full 4x4 selected, it will erase as a 4. So you could erase a whole section if you want, or you can erase that section. If you want to just erase one square at a time, you can just click on one square and then go to the eraser, and you can erase one square at a time. And then you can go back to paintbrush, and let's just paint those back in. So now that we have the tile map, we need to create the terrain that the character is going to walk on. So for that, we are going to go down to the terrain. And in the terrain, it has, so if you see down in the bottom here, so it shows a variety of different terrains. So you have grass terrains, you have what looks like a fall terrain where the grass is brown or leaves on top, and then we have brick and so on. So same as what we did before, I'm going to pause, or if you can take the time here, take a pause and see if you can take these, and again you want to splice these so that they are the same as we did for the other characters and the background. So pause out and do that. Okay, so if you paused out and were able to do the sprite images and to splice them out, that's great. If not, we're going to do that right now. Again, same thing. So we have the terrain selected. You need to make sure this is Sprite 2D and UI. It's multiple images in this. We're going to set this so that it's 16 pixels per unit. And we want these so that they are point, no filter. And then apply them. And then open the Sprite Editor. And we're going to slice these so that they are 16 by 16 and slice them. So it has now sliced all of these into the objects that we're going to be using. So apply it, close it out, and same thing, we are going to just drag this over into, so don't drag it on top of your background, so we can drag it over into beside the background, and it's going to open up the file. Same thing, we want to make sure that these are saved into the art. Into the tile palette, and then we are adding them into there. And again, it's going to import and add all of those objects or create the objects in the tile palette so that we can paint on. And again, I'm going to pause out while this. Okay, we're back now. So now that the tiles have been created, we are going to paint these on into the scene, same as we did for the background. However, we are going to create another tile map. So this is the background. If you were to paint these onto this and then erase it, it's going to erase the background and so on. So it's easier just to maintain the background and then create another tile map. So in the grid, so go back to your grid, right click, go 2D object, and create a tile map, and it'll create a second tile map. So I'm going to rename these now. So background, and we will call this the foreground. So when you are painting these on, so you want to make sure that you have the right one selected. So right now we want to paint the tiles onto the foreground, so you have foreground selected, same as we did for before, so you can paint these on. Just a few things. So if I paint these, so if I select the whole thing and paint it, you'll see that there's little lines in between those tiles. So depending on the tiles that you have downloaded, sometimes there will be edges. So this is an edge piece which would go on the end, and then you have a middle piece which will blend in with the, right? So as you kind of paint with this, it's going to make a much smoother transition and you don't get those lines in the actual, in between the tiles themselves. So it looks cleaner. So I'm going to just continue to paint through to the end here. And I will add a piece onto the end just briefly. And so now we have the scene somewhat created. So if we go to our game view, this is what the game view would look like. Similarly, if we go back just quickly with the camera, so with the camera selected, you could move the camera, you can stretch the camera so that you are seeing, oops. So with the camera, you can drag it and stretch the view of the camera, right? So what do you want to see with the camera itself? So that'll change that part of it. And if we go back to game view, you can see a little bit more of the ground. So if we go back, so in the scene view, so we have background and foreground selected. Now in terms of getting the game to work, we need to give the characters some life or give them some physics essentially. So to do that, we are going to go back to our character. So our character itself, we are going to add a component, and we want to add a rigid body 2D. So we want the rigid body 2D, and this gives it some physics. So it gives it mass, it gives it a gravity scale, and so on. So right now it has, we're just going to leave these set as mass 1, gravity scale 1, and so on. So now that it has a rigid body, we can also, if you push play, for example, it now will have gravity. And the physics itself is going to allow the character to move. Right? Oh, so the character falls off. But where did the character go? You know, why did it fall off the map essentially, or the game, it fall out of the game? So if I go back to this, what you can see is that, and this is where we're going to create or add another thing. So right now it's painting the background on top of our terrain, which is what you don't want that to happen. So if we go back to background, we're going to, so where you have sorting layers, we're going to add a sorting layer. And then for the sorting layer, we're going to add a sorting layer and call this background. So for the default, it will paint them on, but it doesn't really know what order. So this will paint from, so essentially it's going to paint top down. So it's going to do the background first, and then the next layer, and then the next layer, and so on. So I'm going to actually create a midground. So if you wanted to add things in the midground that were in front, so trees, for example, that are maybe in front of that background, but you want them so that they're not interacting with the foreground. And then we're going to create another one and call it foreground. And that should be good. So what you need to do, so go back to the background, click on sorting layer and put it in the background. And then for the foreground, we need to take the foreground, go to sorting layer, put it in the foreground so it paints it on top. Similarly, currently your player is there, but it doesn't know where to put it. So we're going to change its sorting layer and put it in the foreground. So now it is in the foreground. So we had our character falling. However, we need to, the character needs to interact with the ground itself. So to do that, we need to add what's called a collider. So we're going to add a collider. I'm going to add a circle collider 2D. So the circle collider 2D will be created. So right now it's slightly big. So what you can do is edit it. So if you go over to here, edit collider, and then we can just drag it. So this will allow, so basically what this is doing is giving that, so wherever that circle hits with another object, it's going to recognize there's a collision there. So that's the circle collider. Now same thing, we need the ground to have a collider as well. So for the ground, so go to the foreground layer, add a component, and we are going to add a collider. In this case, we're going to add a Tilemap collider. So Tilemap collider 2D. And we are also going to add, so what you'll see here is that, so in the Tilemap, all of these individual objects are set up as a collider. So there's a collider there, and so on. So usually with these types of colliders, we're going to also add a composite collider. So composite collider 2D. And then going back to the Tilemap collider, we're going to say used by composite. And you can see that all of those individual colliders are gone, and it just creates one around the entire object. Same thing, so currently, actually right now, so if we push play, you can see that the character and your ground fell from the game. So why did that happen? Well, first off, so your character you want to fall. However, for your foreground, we don't want, so the rigid body 2D that gets created when you create the colliders, so it'll automatically create the rigid body 2D with that. We don't want it to be dynamic, right? So we want it to essentially be static. So you want to click that to static, which means that it sticks it there and it can't move now in terms of the game. So if we go back and push play, actually I'm going to change my camera so that we can see more of the so if we click play again, so your player falls to the ground and it interacts with the ground, so you've got that collision and now it's there, and this is the beginning of the game. So in the next video, we're going to look at creating movement for your character and some jumping. So have your character move and jump through a scene.